So how would you reply to, we hear this a lot, both in terms of students, the popular press, people in general, even specialists who are writing books about teaching Buddhism and so forth and who have experience back in Asia. They talk about Buddhism as not being a religion. They say it's a philosophy, they say it's a way of life, they say it's a science, but it's not a religion. So focusing on Buddhism in its original context within Asia and not so much thinking about its current adaptations and what that might mean in terms of such claims, how would you respond to people asking the question, is Buddhism in its original context over 2,500 years, is that a religion?
Well, religion itself is a really slippery category, and people have questioned its utility. It's a fairly recent invention, this idea that there is such a thing called religion, and it applies to all these things out there. Generally, it's modeled on a kind of Christian religion, and it's a term that basically was invented by Westerners when they started to go out and look at other phenomenon and sort of say, okay, well, that looks kind of religious, and it looks religious because it looks kind of like what we're doing here. This over here looks kind of superstitious, and this here doesn't look religious at all. So all these categories emerge in a particular context of modernity in the first place. But I'm not saying that we should chuck the category. I still think it's useful. I teach in a religious studies department, so if I say that religion is a meaningless term, I'm talking myself out of a job. But I think if we identify things religious with, certain things like prayer and belief in supernatural beings and things like that, then certainly we find those in Buddhism going very far back, probably back to the beginning. There are all kinds of supernatural beings in the earliest Buddhist scriptures. There's not so much of a devotional worship orientation in the earliest stratum of Buddhist scriptures, but that seems to enter in very quickly. It may have been sort of outside the canons that we have today, still around. So the easy short answer is yes, Buddhism is a religion. And the reason I think people can think of Buddhism as not a religion is because it has been presented in various ways, often by Buddhists themselves, as a kind of way of life, a philosophy, a science of mind, and stuff like that. And, is that a complete misrepresentation? Well, it is if we're talking about Buddhism in its various, multiple contexts in Asia. But it is kind of, I think, an open question whether Buddhism can be practiced today in a kind of non-religious way or in a secularized way. And I think that's possible too. It can become a kind of secularized technology of the self that does not rely on ideas, for instance, of unseen beings, or does not incorporate prayer and mythology, or kind of what we think of today as a kind of mythical cosmos. So that's my shot at an answer.
So if you were to look at, in this case, a religious tradition, or particularly focus in on a specific contemplative tradition and ask the question about what makes it secular, or what would it take to look at a particular contemplative tradition and make a series of changes that would take something that was inherently religious, keeping in mind that religion, like every other word we're going to use today, has a history and is constructed and et cetera, then what would that primarily consist of? What you referred to just now is two different aspects. You talked about, on the one hand, the belief in supernatural beings, and then prayer presumably being potentially a source of, or a medium of communication with them. Then on the other hand, you referred to mythology, which would, I guess, be narratives about the past that somehow we don't think are attested by historical inquiry, or, using the kind of evidentiary resources that we typically embrace within the academy. Could you give us a picture of a sense of thinking pragmatically about how a practice would go from religious to secular, what the primary aspects of that process would be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of issues. I think, first of all, you have to recognize that it might look different in different national contexts, because different national contexts have different ways of dividing up this secular and religious division, these categories. So we're here in America. So I think in this case, I think first of all, you have to be sensitive to where these things are coming from, where these practices are coming from, and kind of be in dialogue with the traditions that we're taking them from. There are practices in Buddhism that were never meant to be kind of widely distributed. And so I think, before you set yourself up as a teacher of tantric contemplation or something like that, you might want to check, what actual tantric practitioners think of the practices that you're teaching. And, just because you read it in a book doesn't necessarily mean that you're authorized to teach it. So I think the first thing is that you have to have kind of an understanding with the traditions themselves, and I think Buddhists have been rather generous actually in sort of offering a lot of their basic meditation techniques to the world, and I don't think it's a matter at this point of cultural appropriation like we would see in say, New Age folks doing Native American rituals or something like that. I think there's a whole other set of issues there. But yeah, I guess the way that divide happens in the U.S., I mean, there is always going to be a little bit of a blurry area, because you're always, I think one of the important things about meditation that I've been thinking about and writing about lately is that it's not just a kind of bare practice in which you have a kind of unmediated access to your own experience or to the world or something like that. You're bringing in certain values, a certain kind of, maybe not explicit, but at least a kind of implicit ethic. So I think, you have to consider what kind of ethic you're bringing to it. So when we sit down and meditate, say, and we go off then and say, well, I think this helped me. I think it helped me today because what? Well, because I didn't yell at my spouse when she did something that annoyed me. Well, there's a value there, that you shouldn't yell. I might live in a cultural context where it's just fine to yell at my spouse, and nobody would say anything about that. But we're bringing a certain value to that meditation seems to foster. So in a sense, meditation is fostering a set of ideas, of values, even if these are often very implicit. And so I think you have to kind of reflect on what those values are and where they come from, and ask whether they're really coming from a particular tradition. And then, of course, the question comes up, are we then kind of imposing a certain kind of religious value system on the people we're teaching? And again, I think there's always a kind of fuzzy area, because people talk, for instance, about civil religion, that there's a kind of unofficial quasi-religion in America that we all sort of espouse. And so is it okay to espouse those values? Is it okay to import certain Buddhist values that could work in a secular context and don't necessarily have a kind of religious connotation in our culture? So yeah, it's a difficult question, really. The how question. Do you have any thoughts yourself about that?
Well, since we actually have to teach about it,
Yeah.
just like you do, I've just been going through it very analytically, and it's great that what you said about situating it within a particular nation or a particular culture, because we often like to just go abstract and say, well, here's how you do the secularization process. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the things I've become interested in is the division between secularization and moving across cultural boundaries, which raises a complex issue, which is, what is the relationship of religion and culture? I think we were raised in certain contexts to think about these as fairly kind of separate things, that religions are a set of beliefs and a set of practices, and culture, on the other hand, is over here and separate. But when we're moving across fairly dramatic cultural differences, such as Europe and America going over to Asian cultures and becoming interested in Buddhism, for example, and then wanting to bring those back, we're moving across two different things if we're interested in secularization. Mm-hmm. We're both trying to think about how might these be appropriate in a public place, a healthcare industry, a K through 12 environment, whatever it might be. And on the other hand, how we might take that very specific tradition within a particular cultural context and move it into a very different cultural context with different assumptions, different values, different aesthetics, and so forth. And it strikes me that a lot of people, including a lot of teachers, are very dismissive of this. They talk about cultural baggage, they talk about culturally laden, or they use dismissive terms like metaphysics or philosophy and so forth. And they just say, we're not going to deal with any of that because we're just going to focus on the real deal, the practice. And yet it raises questions. Is that really the real deal? Is that really the profundity? When Buddhism itself talks about samsara and nirvana being the same thing or being in the same place, and yet we make all these dismissive comments about the stuff we're going to leave behind. Have we really understood what we're doing?
Right. Well, I think that in itself, the very inclination to do that, is also part of our Western culture, because we have a certain strand of Western culture that says basically, in order to self-actualize as an individual, I have to rise above culture. I have to put culture aside. I have to be my own person. And so that whole narrative gets wrapped into Buddhist meditation practices, and changes them in a lot of ways. If I'm meditating in order to create a certain kind of self, whether I conceive of it that way or not, and free myself from society, social influences, cultural influences, I think that's a very different thing than what most Buddhists were doing.
If we go back to your own past, and you grew up in an evangelical tradition, what does someone in an evangelical tradition have to give up in order to imagine that there's something useful? It could be a component, if not the whole tradition, in Buddhism. Because that's a tradition it's a deeply emotional tradition. Yeah. It's a deeply interpersonal and social tradition. And if we can imagine the evangelical traditions as test groups for imagining where's the dividing line between conflict and accommodation. Right?
Yeah. In other words, how
right? If an evangelical member of an evangelical tradition is interested in meditation, what does that need to be? Right?
Yeah.
How Buddhist or un-Buddhist can it be for someone?
Right.
It's an abstract question, but if we can imagine a certain quite well-defined group that places a great deal of importance on their religious identity in America.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think that's where the framing of meditation in completely secular terms, and I'm always using secular in quotes here, has been kind of essential for its popularity, its spread, because on the one hand, we wouldn't be here under the auspices of a contemplative sciences center if that weren't the case, if this is a public institution. And you would never see it in churches because it would be religious competition. It's only if somebody keeps saying over and over, this is not a religious practice in the way we're doing it, that it can have any hope of gaining any traction in a Christian church, say. And this is something that goes back to, I'm reminded, for instance, of a discussion between D.T. Suzuki and Thomas Merton, where they were sort of analyzing the place of meditation. They both did it. And for Suzuki, the idea was, you might have sort of theistic experiences, but ultimately the goal of meditation is to kind of get beyond that, beyond this personal deity and things like that. Whereas for Merton, meditation, kind of the Buddhist meditation, was something on the way to encountering God. So again, these things can be contextualized in dozens of different ways, depending on what particular group they're interacting with.
When you think back to your childhood experience with evangelical Christian communities, and then later you learned very well what Buddhist meditation was, not just in its modernized form, but in its traditional settings, do you see a place in evangelical communities, like a space that you might point to for an evangelical as to this is what Buddhist meditation is about, or where there's analogous kind of moments or analogous practices that would, I think, following what Curtis said, have an opening there?
Yeah, well, I think, thinking of meditation as a kind of psychological practice, I suppose, might be a non-threatening label to put on it. And I also, as I said, I think meditation, in a way, it can be a kind of lens to amplify one's own values and ethics and so on. So if meditation is seen as a tool to live a better life according to a Christian model, and a way of becoming more in touch with your own impulses towards either God or away from God, then I think that's possible. I think the biggest obstacle in very conservative Christian communities is that there's a real belief in supernatural forces that are evil, demons and so on. And I think it's probably much more pervasive than people at universities tend to think. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people think that meditation means kind of making your mind blank, and that leaves a door open for those forces. So there may be a limitation to how far it can.
Well, they might like those tantric forms of meditation where it's about fighting the good fight.
Well, yeah, and yeah, that's possible. Yeah, and there are evangelicals, from what I understand, who are sort of following around the Kala Chakra initiations and cleansing the waters that the sand has been poured on, cleansing it of demons and things like that. And so there is this model of spiritual combat, but usually Buddhism gets on the other side of that.